There are times in life when everything seems to pause, as if the world itself understands the magnitude of a loss. Today, we find ourselves reflecting on such a moment, marking the end of a remarkable journey of voice and presence that reached millions, a preacher, a singer, a spiritual guide who devoted his life to serving others. At the age of 95, Jimmy Swaggart quietly passed away. The news began to ripple gently, finding its way into the homes where his sermons once filled the air, where his music offered comfort and hope. For many, it felt as if a chapter in history had quietly closed. Jimmy Swaggart was never just another minister. He represented a particular kind of gospel fervor that belonged to another era, man who poured his soul into every sermon and song, who lived his days at the intersection of faith and music. His voice, which once rang out with the force of revival, mellowed as the years went by, but its essence remained unchanged. Whether you encountered him in a church pew, through the speakers of a radio, or on a glowing television screen, his presence left an impression that was hard to forget. Now, with his passing, the world feels change more subdued, a little less familiar, as though a comforting melody has faded from the background of life. But this moment is more than the story of someone. Death, it's a reflection on a life that moved hearts, a journey marked by faith, adversity, forgiveness, and worship that resonated across generations. As we look back, we remember not just the man, but the enduring mark he left upon the world. In the months before his passing, those closest to Jimmy began to notice delicate shifts. The once unstoppable energy seemed to slow. His voice, previously strong and commanding, had become softer. His steps to the pulpit were now measured and cautious. Yet, despite the unmistakable signs of aging, Jimmy never relinquished his calling. He continued to preach, sing, and welcome his congregation with the familiar warmth and passion that defined his ministry for decades. Family members, especially Frances and Donnie, started to worry. Trusted friends and loyal staff began visiting more often. The air around the family worship center subtly shifted. It wasn't discussed openly, but those who knew him sensed that time was finally catching up. The man who had spent years traveling the country for revivals was now spending his days at home, surrounded by scripture and loved ones. There were reports of routine hospital visits, but nothing was ever publicly announced. The congregation, always attentive, noticed the small pauses in his sermons. The way Jimmy would sometimes sit down more often, pausing as he searched for the right words. He never complained or sought sympathy. He simply smiled, opened his Bible, and continued his calling. His last sermon, though no one realized it at the time, was particularly moving, gentle, heartfelt, and filled with reflections on heaven, grace, and life's journey. As he looked out at the congregation, his eyes seemed to hold a quiet knowing, as if he sensed that his time was drawing to a close and was at peace with it. For those present, that sermon has become a cherished memory, a tender farewell woven through with scripture. In his final days, Jimmy chose to remain at home, letting the gentle strains of gospel music fill the rooms. He spent hours in his study, paging through old sermon notes and hymnals, surrounded by reminders of a life dedicated to faith. Frances was by his side constantly, while Donnie visited every day, sometimes reading from the Psalms or quietly praying together. The house, once alive with the bustle of meetings and ministry, transformed into a place of peaceful sanctuary for a servant of God preparing for his last journey. It was a calm, golden morning when Jimmy eventually slipped away. The sunrise cast a soft glow through the curtains, bathing the room in warmth. There was no rush or chaos, only a profound stillness and a sacred sense of peace. Jimmy woke early and asked Frances to bring him his Bible. He held it gently, turning the pages, pausing at familiar verses that had guided his life. Frances sat beside him, holding his hand as one of Jimmy's old recordings played a slow, soulful hymn that captured the spirit of his music. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His gaze conveyed everything: gratitude, love, and peace. Just before the end, he closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer. Only Frances knows what passed between him and God in that moment, but she later said he looked as if he was already glimpsing heaven. Moments later, he exhaled softly, as if surrendering his spirit to the Lord. There was no struggle or fear, just a gentle departure. Surrounded by faith and family, Donnie arrived soon after, standing silently at his father's side. The man who had baptized him, mentored him, and shaped his life was gone. Tears filled Donnie's eyes, but he simply squeezed his father's hand and whispered, "You finished strong, Dad." The family gathered, each lost in their own memories. There was no rush to call others or to make announcements. For a few blessed hours, they sat together, grieving, praying, and giving thanks for a life lived with purpose. Outside, the world went on as usual, but within that home, something sacred had occurred. It wasn't just the end of a life, but the completion of a remarkable journey when the news of Jimmy's death was released. It traveled quickly, reaching people across the world. The Family Worship Center shared a simple announcement. Today we celebrate the homegoing of Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, passed peacefully at the age of 95. But beneath those words was a deep tide of emotion felt by millions of people who had watched, listened, and prayed with him for decades. Social media swelled with tributes. People posted favorite sermons, beloved songs, and stories of transformation. Pastors and musicians shared photos and memories from crusades and ministry events. Some called him a spiritual father. Others remembered how he had led them to faith. News outlets ran special segments, replaying classic moments from his broadcasts. His voice preaching with passion, his hands lifted in worship, his music filling sanctuaries with hope. Even those who had once criticized him acknowledged the size of his influence and his indelible place in the history of American faith. Public figures from evangelists to politicians issued statements of condolence. One preacher wrote, "Jimmy was a man of conviction. He inspired a generation and leaves a legacy that cannot be erased." A gospel singer said, "He taught us to worship fearlessly and showed us how to return to God even after we fall." Ordinary people, too, shared their stories. A woman whose father overcame alcoholism after seeing Jimmy on TV. Another who still kept the Bible she ordered from his ministry during her darkest nights. Churches held prayer services and candlelight vigils. In Baton Rouge, people gathered outside his ministry, some crying, others smiling, all remembering the man who had touched their lives. For many, the feeling was not just grief for a preacher, but for a voice of comfort that had accompanied them through trials and joys. His voice had brought hope to countless places: hospital rooms, prison cells, lonely kitchens. Now, in his passing, that voice echoed again, carrying the quiet assurance that his race was over, his mission complete. The day of Jimmy's funeral was somber, the Louisiana sky heavy with clouds. Thousands gathered at the Family Worship Center, traveling from nearby towns, distant cities, and even abroad. They came not to mourn a stranger, but to honor a spiritual father and a pioneer whose voice had changed their lives. The sanctuary overflowed. Every seat was taken. On the stage where Jimmy had so often preached, a simple casket draped with white flowers stood beneath a golden cross. The service began with a hymn dear to Jimmy's heart. As the choir sang, the congregation murmured the words, some through tears. Donnie stepped up to speak, his voice trembling. "Who's my pastor, my mentor, my hero?" he said, sharing stories of their private moments and the lessons learned from his father's example. Other friends, pastors, and musicians followed, each painting a different portrait of Jimmy, the fiery preacher, the gentle counselor, the devoted husband. A renowned gospel singer performed a favorite song, and the hall fell silent except for the quiet sobs of those who had been moved by his music. Then Frances approached, standing by her husband's casket, speaking with gratitude instead of grief. He wasn't perfect, and he never claimed to be. But he loved God with everything he had. He loved us, and he loved all of you. Her voice broke as she finished. He gave his life on this altar, and now he's gone to the throne he preached about for 70 years. The audience rose as a final hymn filled the air. People raised their hands in worship, some weeping, others swaying, sending Jimmy's spirit heavenward through their praise. When the service ended, no one hurried to leave. Many lingered in reflection. Others approached the casket, whispering prayers or touching it one last time. It was a farewell not just to a man, but to a spiritual era. As the funeral faded into memory, what endured was not the tears or even the songs, but the weight of Jimmy's legacy. Stories began to circulate, accounts of revival meetings in the 1970s overflowing with people hungry for the gospel, for sermons that reached into places traditional churches never could, bringing hope to the hopeless. One woman, clutching a battered Bible she'd received from his ministry decades earlier, spoke of how his words had rescued her from her darkest times. The most moving tribute came during a video montage shown at the Family Worship Center, with clips of a young Jimmy preaching on dirt roads, playing the piano with joy, baptizing believers in rivers, and comforting the brokenhearted after services. In a particularly touching moment, he said, "If I have one prayer left before I go, it's that people know Jesus not through me, but through the mercy I've preached my whole life." Friends and family recalled private moments, Jimmy rising before dawn to pray, quietly playing hymns at the piano, weeping over letters sent to his ministry, walking the empty sanctuary after services to pray over each pew. Donnie remarked, "My father was not just a preacher." Memories poured in, revealing that Jimmy was cherished not for perfection, but for his passion, resilience, and unwavering faith. He faced setbacks, endured criticism, and survived public failures. Yet he kept returning, kept preaching, kept singing. His legacy was not about celebrity, but about faithfulness, about showing up, offering hope, and believing deeply in God's grace. Jimmy's burial was a small, intimate gathering. The sky was calm, the gravesite modest, nestled near the grounds where he had spent his life. Family and close friends stood together, the atmosphere thick with emotion but steady with hope. Frances stood by the casket, Donnie at her side, a Bible in hand. There were no lengthy speeches, just heartfelt prayers and soft words. One of Jimmy's oldest friends spoke, recalling Jimmy's wish not to be remembered for his TV fame, but for pointing people to Christ. As the final prayer ended, a choir sang, "There's a River," a song Jimmy had loved all his life. Donnie. And Frances released a white dove, which soared above the grave, a symbol of peace, freedom, and an enduring spirit. One by one, mourners placed flowers on the casket, offering silent prayers and whispered goodbyes. As the casket was lowered, the pastor reminded them, "From dust we came, and to dust we return, but the spirit of those who walk with God shall live forever." Frances later said it didn't feel like an ending, but as if Jimmy had simply gone on ahead. The final goodbye was spoken with gratitude for a life dedicated to faith and love, even though Jimmy's earthly voice has been silenced. His influence continues to echo. For over 70 years, he poured himself into building a legacy that would endure. After his passing, services at the Family Worship Center resumed, marked by solemn determination. Donnie addressed the congregation, emphasizing that the ministry was never about one man, but about the message of the gospel. Frances launched the Jimmy Swaggart Legacy Fund, aiming to distribute Bibles and gospel resources to those in need, continuing his mission. The ministry created a digital archive of Jimmy's work, preserving thousands of hours of sermons and music for future generations. His music saw a revival, climbing charts and reaching new listeners online. People began sharing stories, testimonies from across the globe. From pastors inspired by him as boys, to people who found forgiveness or sobriety through his message. His legacy was not about building monuments, but about building faith. A plaque at the Family Worship Center reads, "Here stood a man who pointed others to Christ." That is, perhaps, the simplest and truest summary of his life. As people adjust to a world without Jimmy Swaggart, His spirit lives in recordings, in teachings, and in the lives he touched. He faced hardship and failure, but he met them with humility and the belief in redemption. People believed his message because he lived it himself. His voice is forever linked to memories of worship, family, and healing. For new generations, his sincerity still resonates, proving that truth and faith do not age. He never wanted to be idolized, only remembered as a man who loved Jesus and served others. And in the end, it is the size of his heart, not his ministry, that endures. His voice lives on in hymns, in sermons, in lifted hands, and in quiet moments of prayer. At 95, Jimmy Swaggart's voice did not die, it rose, carried on the wind of memory, legacy, and hope. As one of his favorite hymns promises, he will sing forevermore. And so may his message of grace, truth, and hope continue to reach those in need of healing. Rest well, Brother Swaggart. Your voice endures.